Time now for our political panel. Keen Hussey from the Institute of Public Affairs and Bill Browne, Senior Researcher at the Australia Institute, joins us live now. Thanks for your time. There's so much to get through. It's a lot. Let's begin with Sydney. Bill, was the New South Wales government too slow to call a lockdown?
It's always a difficult balancing act, and I think what we've seen from New South Wales is there aren't pro and anti-lockdown camps in Australia. There's different approaches. Ultimately, it might be the case that a quicker, shorter lockdown would have headed off the need for this long lockdown. But that said, these are difficult decisions to make. Nobody wants to have lockdowns. They're a necessary tool we have in the toolkit.
Keen, what do you make of the Berejiklian government's response? They've always prided themselves on being the state that can stay open. Should they have acted sooner this time round?
No, I'm actually quite disappointed in Gladys Berejiklian deciding to lock down New South Wales. We really need to have a serious conversation in Australia after almost a year and a half of dealing with coronavirus of whether we are approaching it in the right way. We've maintained this elimination strategy, which sees states go into lockdowns over a couple of cases. And New South Wales was a bit of a holdout, but I think that the moves this week have shown that they are not. We know now what lockdowns do. We know that they devastate the lowest income earners in the country, lower skill workers, lower paid workers, poorer families. They're the ones who bear the brunt of these measures. And we've seen that throughout the pandemic, those in the public sector and the politicians and bureaucrats who decide to implement lockdowns, they don't face the same costs that private sector workers do when they choose to implement lockdown. And I think this is a really dangerous incentive, which we at the IPA have been talking about for some time. Public servants and politicians don't have any skin in the game, so they decide to implement these lockdowns which simply don't impact them. And I think we really need to be talking about the costs and benefits of lockdowns. They're absolutely devastating for Australians, for school children. They've had a devastating impact on Australians' mental health and like I say, on lowest income earners. So we really need to have a serious conversation about, are lockdowns the way we want to go forward throughout the rest of 2021?
Yeah, it's an interesting point. Bill, what do you make of that? We're seeing Darwin go into lockdown for 48 hours. Perth has reintroduced restrictions today. So has Queensland. Are we going back to March 2020?
I think we've learned a lot about addressing COVID in that time, and we have settled on what's fundamentally an elimination strategy. That's also what the Australian people want. The Northern Territory in particular, I think it's very understandable, a short lockdown they've announced at the moment for Greater Darwin, particularly because of the number of Indigenous Australians in the Northern Territory. We know Indigenous Australians are a particularly vulnerable group when it comes to COVID, and so it makes sense to take strong measures to keep COVID out of particularly those remote communities, but to protect people in the Northern Territory. I think there's also a lot that we can learn from the Aboriginal community-controlled health organisations and their response, which has been some of the most successful handling of the COVID pandemic that we've seen in Australia. So we've learned a lot, and lockdowns are an onerous but necessary part of what we're doing to keep it under control and ultimately save lives.
Keen, what do you think about that? Do you think in the Northern Territory situation this lockdown was necessary?
Well, I'm not sure about that. A few cases outside of Darwin necessitating a lockdown doesn't seem like a risk-based, proportionate response to me. And I would push back on one thing. I do not think that Australians want these measures. Some analysis we did at the Institute of Public Affairs found that there was 500,000 low-income earners, so those in the bottom 20% of the income scale, 500,000 of them lost their jobs due to lockdowns in 2020. So I think if we're talking about what Australians want, it would be very hard to look those 500,000 people in the eye and say, you don't get to feed your family, you don't get to pay your mortgage and provide for your loved ones because we're going to force you out of work. We've determined that you are not an essential worker. Your livelihood doesn't matter much to us because we're going to enforce this disproportionate blanket lockdown measure across entire states or across entire cities in response to only 1 or 2 cases. There's only one person in hospital in the whole country with coronavirus. So we really need to get back to the original plan which Australia had, which was a proportionate, risk-based response to this virus. And like you said, it feels like we're back in March 2020. It feels like over the last 18 months we've learned nothing about coronavirus. We've learned nothing about how to deal with it. But that's not true. We know much more than we did in March 2020. And one of the key things that we know is that lockdowns are terrible for Australians.
Bill, who's to blame here? The federal government is... I should say the opposition in the federal parliament is blaming New South Wales outbreak on the slow vaccine rollout. Do they have a point?
I think there's definitely been widespread disappointment about the slow vaccine rollout, the missing of targets. We heard the New South Wales government identifying a lack of supply, a lack of doses as a major reason why they couldn't get vaccination levels where they wanted to be. We heard recently that it could be October before we have enough doses for the adult population. So I think absolutely there's reason to be disappointed there. And this is something that was sowed probably a year ago when we had the opportunity to line up more vaccination doses. So yeah, I think there's definitely a backlash and concern coming. And there's reason to be critical. There's also been some concerns about the distribution of vaccinations. So even the doses that we do have are reports that a majority of aged care workers have not yet been vaccinated. There are unvaccinated frontline workers who've been exposed to COVID. So, there's criticism to go around, but there's definitely a problem that Australia hasn't been front of queue for vaccinations as we expected to be.
Moving on from coronavirus for a moment, Barnaby is back. Barnaby Joyce is set to unveil his cabinet front bench very shortly. Just in a few minutes' time, we're standing by for it. Kian, what do you think about all of this? What kind of implications does this have for the government?
Well, I think there's one key reason why Barnaby is back, and that's the net zero emissions policy, which the Morrison government has crept towards without any mandate. Barnaby Joyce, I think, has given quiet Australians a megaphone. Michael McCormack wasn't doing enough to push back on Scott Morrison's moving towards a net zero emissions target. And this is a really key issue for the National Party. So some analysis that we did at the Institute of Public Affairs indicates that if we were to adopt a net zero emissions target, up to 653,000 jobs would be put at direct risk. 653,000 jobs at direct risk from a net zero emissions target. And these will be concentrated in manufacturing, mining and agricultural industries. And they'll be concentrated, those job losses will be concentrated in regional areas where the Nationals hold seats. So of the top 10 electorates in the country, when you rank them by the number of jobs that they'll lose, the Nationals hold 6 of those 10. So this is a really key issue for the Nationals. Barnaby Joyce is back because Michael McCormack didn't do enough to speak out about the government trying to inch Australia towards a net zero emissions target, and hopefully Barnaby can put this issue to bed. Australians, whenever they're given the opportunity to vote, they had the 2019 climate election and they voted resoundingly that they didn't want radical climate policy. And we know that that's the case because they prioritise their jobs and supporting their families far ahead of reducing carbon emissions in the name of pleasing these elites who gather in Davos each year and determine what they want the rest of the world to do.
Bill, do you agree? Has Barnaby Joyce given a megaphone to those who live out in the regions?
I think people are going to be disappointed if they expect a radical shake-up of policy from the change in leadership in the National Party. There are elements of what the Australian called Barnaby policy, which there's a lot to like about. His defence of the Murugapan family in Billowheeler, from Billowheeler, and his support for Julian Assange on WikiLeaks. But I hope that he keeps advocating for them from within Cabinet. But I don't think that climate policy can be derailed by Barnaby Joyce, because the world is moving in that direction. Already, a net zero by 2050 target looks inadequate. Countries are starting to look at 2030 targets and improving their ambition there, including the United States under the Biden administration. So Australia is going to come under increasing international pressure, and we're also going to face carbon border adjustment tariffs that are being seriously contemplated by a number of countries around the world that are far more ambitious on climate action than we are. Those are going to hurt Australian exports unless we take action ourselves. We will be facing a price on carbon. It's just a question of whether we're the ones collecting the revenue. I think one thing we've also seen is that to entrench his position and justify the change in leadership, Barnaby Joyce needs some early wins. We haven't seen them so far. He said the coalition agreement would be renegotiated. That's not going to happen. He talked about Liberal ministries going to Nationals. That's not going to happen. And his preferred candidate for the Northern Territory Senate, Senator McMahon, has not been pre-selected this week. So I think that's going to be a challenge as he tries to rack up some wins. And it's also going to embolden those moderate Liberals who've already started speaking out about any move to roll back the action on net zero. And indeed, those moderate Liberals will be pushing behind the scenes at least for more climate ambition and more activity.
Bill Browne and Keen Hussey, we have to leave it there. Thanks so much for your time today.
20% get nothing. They're really unfair tax cuts.
People want to see much stronger action from the government when it comes to climate change.
It's no coincidence that we have a wages crisis in Australia.
Transitioning to net zero emissions, it doesn't seem like there's much room for gas.